Welcome to MFP Live. I'm Donna Ladd, the editor and the co-founder of the Mississippi Free Press. I hadn't done this in a minute. Can y'all tell? It's like, woo. And here with me, as always, is publisher and the Chief Revenue Officer, Kimberly Griffin, and the co-founder of the Mississippi Free Press. Welcome, Kimberly.
Hello.
Let's see. I feel like I'm hearing something. Are you guys hearing something? Okay, good. Anyway, we are very excited tonight. There was something going on in my ear. Y'all bear with me here. We're very excited tonight to talk about, I like to put it this way. It's like my favorite, most hated subject, or at least one of them, which is segregation academies in the state of Mississippi and beyond. And we have a real expert on segregation academies here with us tonight. Before I say her name and get her on the mic, I'm going to just tell you guys a little bit. I am going to say her name, but a little bit about Ellen Ann Fentress, who knows a whole lot about segregation academies and went to one and graduated from one, I believe. She writes about Deep South politics and culture, looking for how big truths pulse in individual life stories. Privilege, whiteness, women, French, and food are all topics that she likes to think about. Ellen Ann's work, she's a Mississippi native, I believe, or she's been in Mississippi a long time, she'll tell us, has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, the Baffler, Oxford American, Scalawag, Story South, and New Madrid, other public or other media, as well as Mississippi Public Radio, where she was also a reporter. This amazing journalist launched the Academy Stories, which is about exactly what you think it's about, in 2019, which is an online forum about the impact of the South circa 1970 segregation academies and its past and present. Since then, she's she's also, and she'll tell us about this, but she's launched a project, I believe she calls the Admissions Project, which is about public schools and what was going on in public schools in the lead up to forced integration and afterward, I believe. So she's going to tell us about that. Ellen Ann, we are so tickled to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks. I'm so glad to get to talk about this.
Well, I know you are. And I mean, I'll tell everybody out there, it's like, Ellen Ann and I had dinner at her house one night, and it was just like this. And a lot of it had to do with segregation academies, because we're both very interested in this topic. So I want you to start out by just telling us how it came to be that you decided to start to launch the Academy Stories in the first place.
Well, and it had to do with your publication with in the Mississippi Free Press. When Cindy Hyde-Smith was running for U.S. Senate, Ashton Pittman had a story about how she was a graduate of Lawrence County Academy, had the annual with her picture as a cheerleader, and the story was picked up nationally. And what was news to me was what news it was to the country, and to see the shock in the country, because and it amazed me that I didn't see that I had been so normalized to it, like so many people of my generation, that I didn't think about it as being news, that so many of us had graduated from schools like this. So yeah, it just made me start thinking. And about that time, I saw Casey Lehman at Lemuria Bookstore here in Jackson, and he was talking about how come in these stories, like, they're going on back then in 2019, some of those blackface stories, how come whenever like a white politician would get caught in a story like that he said, how come they always say it wasn't them? What he wanted to see was a story where some white person was, caught doing what they were doing and said, yeah, that was me, and this is what I was thinking. And so I kind of took the challenge, accepted. And I started thinking about going to Pillow Academy in Greenwood. I'm a lifelong Mississippian, born in Greenwood, went to school there starting in the second half of 8th grade, and just thinking about it and how it affects you when I just had never thought about it really a lot. I mean, what I'd tried to do was just not put it on my Facebook or just not talk about it to be in this world. But it's what I don't know what out of this. That's just sort of privilege to think I can cherry pick what people know about me. So I wrote a story about it. It was an essay about my experience, and Bitter Southerner published it in June of 2019. And I didn't really know what to expect. There's a lot of white fragility out there and just good people, but they just don't want to question what their parents did. So, but I was amazed at the number of people that reached out to me, emailed me from all over the country who had graduated from a segregation academy and said, "Thank you. I have not known what to do about this. I just haven't talked about it. And I don't know what to do about it." But it made me think it's time to do this site. The Mississippi Humanities Commission gave me a small grant, and we started the Academy Story. And props to Talamika Bright for coming up with the double entendre name, the Academy Story, because stories of those of us in academies, but also just kind of the mythical things that can get in your mind when you're in a white silo like that. So it started then and went on for about a year like that. And then Humanities gave us another grant. And as you said, it's now called the Admissions Project. And it takes in both the academy stories and stories from public schools, because there are plenty of stories from public schools. The more I get into it, the more I'm realizing that at that time, integration was so white-centered and often done in such bad faith that there are plenty of stories to tell from the public schools. So so that it's been going on that long, and I'll stop right here and let y'all ask some questions before I ramble on.
Well, and a couple things to say here real quick. One, that story that Ashton did was originally in the Jackson Free Press, which, as most of you know now, all of its journalism and stories are now part of the Mississippi Free Press. They weren't for a while. But I mean, you make a really good point about that. And I want to emphasize it, that this idea that, however you put it, but that you hadn't really thought it was something that you would be talking about or that would interest somebody or whatever, at the same time that you were kind of hiding it in a way, right? And it's that, I think that's really interesting, and it's kind of built in, because I've known a lot of people too, we all have around here, who went to legacy segregation academies, who are very proud of being graduates of those schools, and just like everybody else is with school spirit, at the same time, they don't always want to talk about them, or they just defend it and say that there's nothing wrong with it, right? So I guess whatever you want to say about that, but I also want to, as part of this question, just encourage you to tell us more about what it was like for you as a student at Pillow Academy, and what you remember particularly around this idea of it, because it was a straight up whites only academy that was established. Let's just say this right up front, right? That was established for only white kids back at that point. So talk more about those things.
Okay. Yes. When it was started, someone of my generation, now I'll get people that come along, and part of their story is realizing their legacy segregation academy stories, because none of them talk about it. I'm not aware of anyone, except I did hear Montgomery, Alabama Academy has talked about it a little, but other than that, I don't know any that admit. Look at their websites, and they all talk about it's amazing. Somewhere in the late 60s or 1970s, everybody in their town just decided it was time for a prep school for a quality education, and that's what it is. So, but someone of my generation, this is like, so I would have entered as a second, right at the time of Alexander versus Holmes, the suit, that the landmark case about no more all deliberate speed, integration now. It happened for me in January of my 8th grade year. I think that was 1970. And so that's when I went. But someone of my generation, there was, everybody there knew why we were there, that there was no denying it, or that was just, it was acknowledged. one of the founders of the Citizens Council founded Pillow Academy. And but in an odd way, you may be surprised at how little was said, because once we were there in that silo, what had to be said? And you were here. I lived in Greenwood, and there were 50% white, 50% black at that time in 1970. And I didn't know a single black young person my age. I was just there, and I don't know how you're supposed to navigate the modern world if that's the case. But so you'd kind of be surprised at really how little overtly was said, because it didn't have to be said. The whole premise was there. I think I said in my essay that it's kind of like asking the fish, how's the water? And the fish says, what's water? Because there's no need to ask. That's all you know.
So I think it'd be interesting to do a little bit, because I think we all, as lifelong Mississippians, but I will be clear, I did not know what a segregation academy was. So I was probably in my 30s. Like, I knew what it was. I didn't know the term.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be interesting to backtrack a little bit and talk about why they're called it's obvious, but why they're called segregation academy. I always think of the young person doing their thesis and coming across MFP Live to help them sort through, and how they came about, because I think that helps inform people when they're out looking at schools and they can kind of look at the years, and it kind of tips you off as to who they are and what their background is. But talk a little bit about how they came about, and throughout Mississippi, and what spurred all of these small town councils to start.
Kimberly, that's a great question about the term segregation academy, because like you, I never heard it, because that's not what they were saying at my academy. They were just talking about, it was the quality education. But I believe, like, looking back, I'm starting to see there were references back to it at that very time from white people critical of the people that were pulling out of public schools, and it started then. But I didn't hear it. I think it's become more prominent now. Now, looking back at history, since we're investigating in it. I know I did a program at Delta State, and some people there accused me of coming up with the term, and that I'd put it all in Wikipedia. But no, I didn't come up with it. That's what they're called. But the history of them. So starting after Brown versus Board of Education in Mississippi most of all, and all over the South, so much of politics was involved in stonewalling against implementing Brown and separate, and having two school systems. And so much was done, and the can was kicked down the road so long, even though in Brown the language was this should happen with all deliberate speed. We all know it didn't. And some towns were started. The Citizens Council formed the very year of Brown, within weeks of Brown, for that very reason. The Citizens Council being this white kind of more business, like a Main Street type of white supremacist organization, not the Klan, but the white supremacists, and they were stopping any kind of equality by all means possible. And so when the Citizens Council was formed, their prime objective was stonewalling education. They have a great publication called, I say great because it's like so telling, it's called The Citizen. If anyone is interested in looking at it, the University of Mississippi Library has the entire archive online of The Citizen. And there was a 1964 monthly issue. The whole issue is dedicated to how to found a public school. I mean, how to found a academy in your town. So, and it gives all the steps to do. And so that's how it started. So the Citizens Council wanted to serve as an education center and a template. And then they ended up having the model school in Jackson. That's kind of the first school in Jackson was, some of y'all will know this, in Fondren. It's now it's a right behind the Pig and Pint. It's a 2-story building that I think they have a lot of recovery meetings there, which is kind of interesting. I'm glad they're having recovery there now. But that was the first Citizens Council school. And so Citizens Council schools popped up all over the place, but not all of them were run by the Citizens Council. For example, Pilla in Greenwood, someone involved in the Citizens Council was one of the founders, but it wasn't a Citizens Council school. And they just, that's what the Citizens Council was trying to encourage, that they didn't have to start them all, but that they wanted to be a resource for anyone who wanted to. And so not only in Mississippi, but in 11 states at about this time, segregation academies started popping up. One of the most fascinating cases was in Prince Edward County, Virginia. One of the first writers for the Academy story is Kristen Green. She's got a new book out. I highly recommend all of her books that she wrote about. She's written a New York Times lauded history called Something Has to Be Done About Prince Edward County. And in Prince Edward County, Virginia, this is amazing. They just closed the public schools for 5 years. There was no public school for 5 years. And they opened an academy, Prince Edward Academy, for the white children. And many Black children had absolutely no schooling for 5 years. Some children never, ever went back to school. Those that could, maybe they went to stay with a friend or a grandmother or an aunt that was in an adjacent district or in another town to go to school. But this is also an interesting part of the story, is that later on, the Virginia, their lawmaking body, I don't think they don't call it a legislature, but the first case of reparations happened. It was a bipartisan vote of the lawmakers in Virginia of reparations for the students damaged by that 5 years out of school in Prince Edward County. Mm-hmm. So I'd encourage anyone to read. She wrote, her book is called Something Must Be Done About Prince Edward County, and her grandfather, I believe, was a dentist in town and was one of the founders. And Kristen went to the school herself, and just the whole. And she goes back and she talks to some of the founders and some of the people in town, and to some of the Black citizens in the town that she had never really had thought about, nor did they particularly tell her about the way they suffered from this.
It's interesting you talk about that, and it's not until recently I always encourage people to sit down and ask their elders questions. So my father had 11 brothers and sisters. I think 2 of them died, and they lived in Terry. And my grandmother was determined that everybody would have a college degree, and she succeeded at that, with the exception of one person who had some health problems. Maybe 2 of them had some health problems. But I was always confused why they always graduated from different high schools. And it wasn't until recently that I realized that my grandmother was, so she sent the boys to Jackson on the truck to Lanier. But then the girls went to school and had to, at a boarding house, you're 15, you go to a boarding house in Brookhaven because that's where a Black school is. Then they went to then my youngest aunt graduated from Sumner Hill in Clinton. Again, she had to go live with family or go to a boarding house in order to get an education. So it's kind of like those young people in that county were having to navigate the educational system after it was supposed to be fair and free, whereas my family was navigating it before it was supposed to be fair and free. But you're doing the same thing before Brown v. Topeka Board of Education and after.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And on the site, I think it's kind of the third rail of the story. And I think it also applies to when we look at the economics of towns that have just become just as polarized between the races in the schooling now with an academy and public schools. But the third rail is the people that just simply left the state. And there are 2 fabulous stories on the site. One, a story from a Black family in Laurel, Paulette Boudreaux. Anyone who hasn't read Paulette Boudreaux's novel, Mulberry, please go order it right now. It's fabulous. She tells the story about how her family sent her to Texas to go to an integrated school. And it was not the best environment. They are very unsupported. In fact, the title of her essay is "Put Your Hand Down, Little Colored Girl." And then she came back to Laurel. And then at some point, before she went to high school, her family just moved to the Bay Area. They had some relatives in the Bay Area. And so Paulette finished school in the Bay Area and teaches at a college out in the Bay Area now. So they left. And then also the white equivalent of that story is Margaret McMullen, wonderful writer, now on the coast. Her family was in Jackson, and her father was so dismayed by the white climate in Mississippi at that time that they moved to the Chicago area. Margaret's come back after living, growing up in the Midwest and teaching at the University of Evansville. She's back now writing, but it's a wonderful story from hers. And yeah, you think about, that's another thing. It wasn't just the segregation academies or public schools. There's Margaret's story. It was the people that simply, they either had to leave or chose to leave.
So in your stories, so let's go back a little bit. What did your family tell you? Because I read Dr. Bridget Purcell was one of my old professors and a good friend of mine. So I went and read her story about what her family told her. What did your family tell you when you were changing schools, when your whole environment was changing, when a new school is popping up? What did they tell you?
Well, it was as vague as we Academy graduates will tend to be. I look back on it and I've tried to kind of like resurrect what did go on. Why did I go? Because my parents had registered me for the school, I guess, when as Alexander versus Holmes was becoming a reality in the fall. I was registered to go to Pilla, but I was really not told. I was not told flat out I was going to Pilla. They wanted me to, but I think they kind of wanted it to be. They wanted me to think it was my decision, and my best friends were going to go, and I think I just followed along, sort of. Maybe if I hadn't followed along, sort of, they would have like packed me in the car and dropped me off there anyway. But I think that's telling. And I'd like to say that about the parents. So many people have told me they love the project, they believe in the project, but they would never write a piece because it just made them feel so disloyal to their parents. I just feel like love my parents. Let the record show I love my parents. They were wonderful people. But at the same time, I'm responsible for my life now, and so that's where I leave the focus now.
Yeah, that's a Southern thing. There's some stuff I'm not gonna write. So my parents are way in the ground. It's just some things are not gonna be said. But I'm so glad you all have been so brave. I think Donna wants to get in.
Oh, well, a couple things I wanted to bring into this, and one of them was this idea. It's not only that they were setting up those schools and that they were pulling kids out. Some of the early schools were like as early as 1964. I mean, some of them really early. Now, most of them are going to be 1970 because that over Christmas break, I remember it well as a third grader. But I stayed in public school. But that's when the U.S. Supreme Court forced the schools to integrate, right? Like, do it now. And that was the Alexander v. Holmes decision that you're talking about. And just so people who may not know this, but that's Holmes County. And the Alexander is the mother who was trying to get her kids into the public schools in Holmes County, right here in Mississippi.
I'm reading about it this afternoon. I'm involved in a little project for that, and it was the whole Alexander family. But the one who is on it is the daughter Beatrice Alexander, because she was the first in the alphabet.
So she's the one that the name actually represents. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah, she was an 18-year-old.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. She was a student at Chula Attendance Center, a historically Black school, when the petition to Holmes County School Board went along. And I don't believe, I've been talking to some people trying to connect, and I'm so sorry to say that she is passed away. I was hoping I could talk to her, but I believe she finished her whole high school career at Chula Attendance Center in the amount of the can being kicked down the road by the court system. But Alexander v. Holmes, it's a fascinating case. There's only one book that I'm aware of that's out there. It's called Integration Now, which was the words from the U.S. Supreme Court decision on it about no more with all deliberate speed. By February 1, everything is to be integrated. Yeah, but it came out of that. There were 33 cases going on in Mississippi. I think these were all Mississippi cases at the time that were bundled together and went to the Supreme Court, and they had they expedited the hearing in October and came up with the decision. I'm glad you're putting that up about the book Integration Now. In the foreword to the book, the Professor Hutzwit, who wrote the book, talks about how little has been written about this, that his book is out there. And as far as when he wrote it, he was only aware of one scholarly article in the Notre Dame Law Review. And yet this is, this replaced All Deliberate Speed. And it was a tremendous case, A1 in the New York Times when it came out. And although it didn't cover every school district, they weren't in it, but it was the principle that was going to apply to any school district that asked for more time after that. So it swept the South.
That's right. And one thing I want to say is that when I was researching it for this recent Segregation Academy story, I did as part of our BWC project, our Black Women COVID project in Noxubee County. I could find very little actually on the Alexander family. So that's something that I'm interested in looking into more. It's as if even the media archives didn't do a very good job of covering that family. But the thing I want to bring in here, which I write about in some detail in this story, is how the early vouchers worked to basically to allow these white families who, and people have to imagine it, it's complete white resistance, these white families who are pulling, not just setting up these schools, but transferring tax money into them, and very deliberately. And one of the things that I had put in the story is that back in 1964, Governor Paul B. Johnson had called a special session to pass the early voucher law. And the idea here, I mean, he had already run a really racist campaign, but the idea is that they passed the law in 1964 for vouchers to take money out of tax money and put in the schools. And then the other ways that they were doing it were things like a lot of, like in Noxubee County, this happened where they were the local school district. They were still allowing the Seg Academies, because it's still white people in charge at that point. They were allowing the Seg Academies to take resources out of the actual public schools directly. And so a lot of that was happening. And as I know Ellen Ann knows, there were all of these lawsuits and efforts to stop the segregation academies, straight up, whites only, folks. None of this subterfuge from these days, right? But to actually stop them from doing that. And they kept losing cases in a lot of schools, and a lot of the I'm sorry, y'all, to have to say it out loud, but a lot of the legacy segregation academies that you all know and know about, and many of you love today, were parts of those lawsuits that were stopping that. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, if there's something that you want to add to that idea that they not only wanted to start their own schools, but they believed, and many still believe today, that those schools should be able to take advantage of tax money.
Yes. Yeah,
right?
that's like the vouchers are the perfect example of why we have to talk about this history, and to just kind of gloss over it and let it be and think about, well, that was just my parents. To the idea of the vouchers and how it's like, this isn't just history, this is still coming back today. And you have to study that time and some of the things that went on about drawing out resources from the schools at the time to be able to spot these things now. So yeah, I believe it was something like, wasn't it something like $180 odd for every student that would go? And I'd seen some math somewhere in the Citizens Council about this is the kind of showing, okay, if you have this minus this is how you're going to, you can go to a SEG Academy for free, you know. Interesting about how, yes, how they started that in 1964, 6 years ahead of Alexander and a lot of the schools popping up, because there were, notice the ones that started early. Pilla started early. Indianola Academy started early. I recently read an old article from the Greenville Delta Democrat Times. Mel Leventhal was one of the lead attorneys for the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP. He was the one who recruited the litigants in homes. He was quoted in about 1970 talking about the academies. And he said, you know, there are a lot of these schools that have popped up in 1970 and that they're going to go by the wayside. People are kind of flipped out, and the dust is going to settle and they're going to close. And, you know, a lot of the small ones did. But he said, you know, the ones that were started early and were well funded, they're going to stick around. Those were founded because people just flat did not want to go their white students to go to school with black students. So in a way, you look at the history and that's kind of come to be.
Well, a good example of that, go back to Ashton's original story that fired you up over this. Cindy Hyde Smith went to Lawrence County Academy, which did not make it, right? And it closed years ago. She sent her daughter to Brookhaven Academy, which was a straight up segregation academy. And that's the legacy of it. You know, it's still not very diverse. You know, nowadays it's like most of these segregation academies, it's a mix, but most of them have, they've kind of declared that their main thing these days is not segregation. I mean, you know, they've moved away from segregation, and that their goals are about college prep, and they're about you know, more, you know, better sounding things. But they, you know, they still don't have extreme diversity. And I'm going to get to a question when after Kimberly gets in here in a minute. I'll bring it back to curriculum. So let's just like put a pin in that one. But so anyway, so that's right on point for the way these schools work. Now, something I wanted to kind of add to what you said that was in my Noxubee story, kind of about the tax exempt status. Here's a couple of factoids for people. Central Academy in Noxubee County in Macon was one of the academies that really battled with the federal government over its practices, and it was determined to stay nonprofit. But the IRS had revoked CA's tax exempt status in 1971 because they wouldn't admit Black kids, right? Now, by 1978, the Mississippi Attorney General's office had to force 4 academies. Here you go, Ellen Ann. Manchester Academy in Yazoo City, Washington Academy in Greenville, Pillow Academy in Greenwood, and Noxubee Central Academy to repay $50,000 in public funds misallocated to the whites-only schools. And then the other history point I'll mention here is, so after that started happening and their tax exempt status was revoked, that went along just fine until Ronald Reagan was elected president. And then the Democratic president before him and the 2 Republican presidents before him were against them being tax exempt, but Ronald Reagan both ran on a platform and then pushed to make segregation academies tax exempt once again. And there was at that point, hundreds of them. And this included schools outside of Mississippi. Mississippi's just actually had, the most, and still does, frankly, with the legacy ones, still it's the most concentrated. And so dozens of the ones that Reagan was trying to make tax exempt all over again were in Mississippi, and Starkville, Meridian, Columbus, in the capital city, Jackson Academy, and so on. So I just want to throw that on out there on the pile because I'm willing to say these things out loud because this is history. So I guess what I would like you to address on that, Ellen Ann, you've already mentioned a little bit about the economics of this and the effects of, like you drive up, I've said this a lot, from Indianola to Tallahatchie County up where the prisons are, how many segregation academies are through there, and there are barely white people around there anymore. And some of them are across the street from public schools. I mean, it's just really insane. So talk more about the effects that you believe that this has had on the economics of these towns in Mississippi and a lot of these crumbling towns,
Yes, I look back and you think about, and this is like air quotes, but the people that founded the academies in their towns in the 60s and 70s, these Main Street people, white business people, they thought they had solved their problem. Well, what they did, it looks to me like they may have signed a death warrant for their communities in a couple of generations as things kind of kept moving along. Because, which is like, but what was the situation then? It's just like as once the critical momentum passed, it became more polarized and more polarized. Like, for example, Greenwood, I know the Greenwood's population has gone down. And you think about a lot of these towns that now are just pretty much in the same situation as it was before pre-Brown, with extremely predominantly Black public school and extremely predominantly white academy. And, you really can't, how do you? This is a question, any economist out there that could figure out how we could quantify this, I'm anxious to do it. I've asked some people, but how do you measure people that chose not to live in a community because it's a situation like that? Because you can only measure who's there, but you can't measure who's not there. Kind of like the stories of Paulette Boudreaux's family or Margaret McMullen's family, the ones that opt not to. I've heard from some towns that have this polarized situation that people in town said, oh yeah, when we try to recruit business, that's one of the first things that's said is that, why would you go to a town like this that where people want to locate as a town with a thriving public school?
Well, and I just want to make this point real quick and then turn it back to Kimberly. You've already talked about the Citizens Council, and the context here is that the Citizens Council was actually pushing people to leave cities like Jackson and other cities to either, first to pull their kids into those schools, like, Council McClure, where Governor Bryant went, was a council school, and the council schools were the most virulently racist of all the schools. I mean, there's just, they taught that Black kids were born inferior. It's in their lesson plans. Mm-hmm. And so the point is that they were pushing the flight. That is very important for people to understand. So when people are dumping on, our cities and the conditions of our cities and towns, whether it's Macomb or Greenwood or wherever, is that you had very racist leaders, including this business class of leaders, who were pushing people to do anything but segregate or but integrate. And that included that included running to the suburbs after a certain period of time too. So, I mean, I like the idea of tying back your Citizens Council point into what was going on economically around the segregation academies, because those are very important links for people to make. And you and I have talked a lot about this. I don't know if there's something else you want to add to that.
You were talking about when Reagan came back in, and the idea of the holy grail of getting your tax deductible status back. Great book on how Mississippi kind of once again being the lens through seeing a whole American, the behavior of America. The book by Joseph Crispino, Mississippi Native in Search of Another Country, how sort of the Southern strategy and the Republican strategy of that time accommodated whites that were opposed to integration at that time. And one of the things that a phrase I believe Joe Crespino came up with it, practical integration, and dating it back even to the 50s, when you see how, okay, allowing a little integration because that will protect you from that will protect your institution from being flat out having, maybe losing your tax deductible status. And yet, so yeah, and to me, that's exactly where the schools are right now. Yes, it's very hard to find one that doesn't have a few Black students enrolled now, but that would be what they would say about, see, we're not about that anymore. This is what we're doing. And yet, that's the same dynamic as practical integration, because I still don't see them acknowledging their history, or maybe, really having a lot of Black faculty or any Black faculty, or adjusting their curriculum. Yeah.
We are going to bring in a question from Facebook. This is a robust discussion, and Ellen Ann, you should reach out to some of these people and ask. I'm sure they have some stories for your site, because they're like, go Ellen. So question from Facebook. Thanks for doing this. This is Chauncey Spears. I hope I'm saying your name right. What about the education you and other alums of segregation academies can you see, and how Mississippi fares socially, economically, politically today? I think you've answered some of this, but I'd love to see you talk about drilling down. We talked a little bit about the social aspect before we went live, and we can see it play out in politics, but I'd love to hear, as does with Chauncey, your take on things.
Yeah, but when you think about a school, even if, as mine, I mean, I've rarely heard anything just horribly racist in the classroom, because it wasn't necessary, because the whole system was that way. But the idea of educating generations of students, predominantly of white students, that predominantly have hardly any contact with anyone outside of their silo, what does that speak to how we're all supposed to get along and have empathy and and just navigate as a society? This is tough. I think, even if you have like pretty solid pencil and paper book achievement, if you don't have that basic understanding, just an understanding of anyone who isn't just like you, that's I don't know what that says and what that bodes for the future. A very interesting thing that's happened in the last few workshops I've done is how much I've heard a lot of passion from students and from alums, the LGBTQ of academies, and they want to write their stories, because it really makes sense. If you're in this system where this white male cis is what is valued, that anyone who doesn't fit the bill and is a little bit out of that paradigm, that you feel it. And someone that had gone to a white school then went and was one of about 4 or 5 white students at Heidelberg High School was telling me he was so touched by that when he got to the other environment, how much there was just so much more of a live and let live about everything, not just about race.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about what you hear from maybe younger folks who have gone to these academies more recently, when you encounter them in your talks, or maybe even in the classroom, because I know you're a professor. What's the feedback you get from them?
I've had several that have told me that what you're describing is really not much different from what I'm in right now. Maybe there are a few, there's some Black students in the classroom, but yet it's just this white centric world. I've heard that. Now, the recent story that's up on the website on the front page of the website, Brittany Wilson, African American alum of Jackson Prep, wrote a powerful story. She's a Millsaps junior these days. She wrote a very powerful story, just expressing her. She said she's glad she went to prep. That, but at the same time, all just how white centric it was, and the microaggressions and some of the things that she needed to deal with, and that really hadn't changed.
And I lost something. So you've added a component to your site, and now you are talking about to people who experienced early desegregation in public schools or even mid-level desegregation in public schools. Why did you decide to add that component?
Because, here I am from my silo. I kind of assumed it was sort of this, like Remember the Titans. It was this heroic thing. If you went to public schools, the butterflies were flitting around and the sun was shining and everything was great, which is, totally not true. But, leave it to me to not know that. And talking around to different people and reading more, I realized that how white centric the integration was in so many towns in Mississippi and otherwise, that there would be the grand black traditional high school that was just shuttered, and the grand English teacher or the coach, those people became the vice principal or the vice coach at the combined white school, and the black students kind of got lost in the shuffle. I know that happened in Greenwood, definitely. One of the stories two of the stories I'd urge you to look at. One is Ralph Eubanks, incredible writer from Mississippi, who wrote about his story about how exhausting it was being the model minority in one of the first classes in Mount Olive. And, he talked about it was a good experience for him to be generous. And, he writes for the New Yorker, and wonderful author, how generous that he wrote this for the site. But he said, he's kind of wondered what to do with this for his whole life. And a lot of people have said that, not only the academy students, but the public school students too, that it was, back then you're a student, you're just trying to get through the day, and there's a lot to get through. And also, as someone who's 15, you don't even think about your story is American history, and to really honor it. So I think it's taken that long for those of us to do it.
Well, one thing I'd love for you to delve into is there's something else I don't think people realize about the black teachers they let stay at or go to the mixed race schools, is there seems to be a pattern of colorism. So they prefer to have some of the lighter black teachers at the school, if they were allowed to be a part of the first set of desegregated schools. I learned this from my history teacher, who at Callaway, who had come to the faculty in 1971 in Jackson, Mississippi. And they thought, he was very fair. He was a black man, so they thought it was going to be okay. But they did not know Mr. Marshall, and it was not okay. But he was kind of a rabble rouser. But he was one of the first people that told us. He said, "Go look at the old yearbooks and see who got to come and desegregate the schools."
Very interesting. The other story I'd love to commend is the story from my counterpart, Tim Alford. He's a physician in Kosciuszko now, but he stayed in the public school when I went to Pilla, and he talks about the experience on that side. And this remarkable world-class musician, Mulgrew Miller. I think he's got his own channel on Sirius Radio. And it's called Mulgrew Miller Saw Us Through. That's Peter Alford, his brother, also a physician in North Carolina, wrote his story. But this story about Mulgrew Miller, that's the irony of this idea of the quality education at the academy. So at the public school, my age, and I never had the honor of meeting Mulgrew Miller, he became a world-class, one of the great jazz pianists of the world. He traveled the world with Duke Ellington. And so read that story. When we had the story, when it came up on the site, I noticed like Jazz at Lincoln Center and the San Francisco jazz community, they were all sharing this story and talking about, they didn't know about this part of his life and what he had dealt with at that age. And so it's just amazing the way these stories spread out and they impact the whole country.
So I don't want to get out of here, but without talking about the curriculum, because you were, and I don't mean just then. Okay, I just kind of want to make this point. When I was doing this story about Noxubee County and Central Academy, And I think Central Academy just closed like in the last 5 years or so. I mean, but one of the things I was able to do is find their I found their handbook or whatever on, in the Wayback Machine or something. They had taken it down, and the two of the curricula that they used at Central Academy is Ubeka and Bob Jones. And so I can't get all into this right now. I have kind of a long section in that story that hopefully someone will magically put up again. There we go. But this curricula, you can see here, I kind of delved into it, but both of the curricula have lessons that downplay the harms and reality of slavery. There's blaming Obama for worsening race relations, dismissing Black Lives Matter movement as harmful, romanticizing the Confederacy. You can see here myths about the early Ku Klux Klan. All of it, and there's a lot of this, and most people may or may not know that Bob Jones University was has a very racist history, as Bob Jones did. All of that is very easily discoverable, and the Ubeka curriculum is out of Pensacola, and all of that is in my story as well. But here's my point of saying this, is that a lot of the curricula that including the revisionist curricula that's in a lot of this is about it is a lot of the political rhetoric that we're hearing today in the anti-CRT movements and that kind of thing. So I guess my point here, and then I'd love to hear what you say about it, Ellen Ann, is that a lot of young people are getting it honest, quote unquote. I mean, right? Mm-hmm. Because this is what they're being taught.
And in fact, those two you're talking about, the last workshop I did was for the McMullen Young Writers Institute, young writers from all over the states. And I had one student that was an Academy alum told me exactly those two, Bob Jones and Becca, was what was her curriculum.
That's right. And they're very popular curricula. So I can't go into it deeper, but I do suggest that people read the story, because here's the thing. This company, the Ubeka company and Bob Jones curricula, they make a lot of money. And this curricula is not just in the Deep South. They're in private schools, many private schools across the country. And so, that's their business maybe, but it's also everybody else's business if those things are being taught. So they're the kinds of things that people really need to know about, right? Mm-hmm. And then I think we have a viewer question that we could pop up here real quick. There we go. Buses were used to switch the students. For example, a white Murrah student would be bused to historically Black Lanier. Have you come across much about busing?
I really haven't. And that became kind of the buzzword up in Boston a few years later. But that's a good question, and that has not come up at all. Very interesting.
Yeah, the stuff that I ran into was more about using. I think in Noxubee, I think it's in my story where they were actually using some buses from the public schools and got in trouble for that. I think that was there. It was.
I bet that happened.
Yeah,
a lot of
so
places.
those things were happening.
Yeah.
But as you can see from those photos over at Central Academy, it's like they just disappeared out of those schools and the buildings. The school bus is backed up with broken windows. I mean, it's quite the scene over there, as you can see from these pictures I took. I think busing was more of a northern issue politically. Because these debates, and I think that's worth emphasizing, Ellen Ann, these debates are not just a Southern thing.
Absolutely.
We did and a lot of people, including Nicole Hannah-Jones and many other people have written about this, and a lot wrote about it after Ashton's Seg Academy story introduced Seg Academy into the lexicon, that these things were happening all over the country. They just didn't do it quite the same way. If you want to address that a little bit.
Yes, and I say this at every workshop I do. I'm not doing this for the people in the rest of the country to look and say, oh, That's where the racists are. They're all in Mississippi. And we have plenty to answer for. But no, this is a template for any community anywhere to just examine their past and ways they participated in systemic racism. So this applies everywhere. Just Mississippi is pretty much everything that comes along. Mississippi is the easy read version where you can just see it so clearly. And I do want to say before we get off that if anyone believes in this work and is would like to support this work, your donations are so welcome. We are now working on a podcast, and pretty much the cupboard is bare to get the transcriptions for all the recordings we've already done. So we'd be so honored if anyone wanted to give a tax deductible donation. That's the link to it. We're hopefully this podcast, we're going to have a it's going to be a produced podcast, kind of like in the This American Life vein, and do three episodes so far. But one is out of Heidelberg. So anyone who is listening that has a contact in Heidelberg and wanted to connect me with someone there, love to hear from anyone about talking about the schools in Heidelberg. Their academy closed a couple of years ago. And then also in Greenwood, and then we're going to do one just about the project overall. So yeah, I had to get the plug in.
No, that was good. And I'm smiling because Heidelberg, on one of our road trips, I think that's a little town where the Confederate statues, y'all, is in front of the public library.
It is. I've been there several times.
Oh my God. Oh
yeah,
my
this
God.
summer I've been several times, and you know they have a Black administration, and you're just like, why is it there?
Well, I know there was some efforts. There was some people over there who were trying to get it, and this was like, I haven't checked again since probably 2020, but I know there were some people who were trying to get it to, we did it. This is Todd y'all should watch this driving history. It's very funny when he's gitchy gooing the Confederate soldier up there. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous, people. I don't know how else to say it, but it is ridiculous the way we lift up this Confederate symbology, and this is not it. Let's do something about this. Okay, I just said that, but y'all know I believe it. So Ellen Ann, this has been fabulous to have you here with us tonight. There is so much more, so much more we could talk about.
Yeah, let's do it again.
That's right. But here's what those watching need to do. You need to go to Ellen Ann's site and read the stories, because there's so many great stories there. You need to share the stories. You need to share the stories with people, with other white people that you know, and share the stories. And then, and also we're collaborating now because Ellen Ann's also an advisory board member.
Yep.
And so we're featuring some of those stories regularly in a box on the front page of the Mississippi Free Press. So at MississippiFreePress.org as well. And so and we put the donate link in the chat. If y'all need to get in touch and get a shorter version of that link, just write me or write us and ask us about this. Go to the Admissions Project site. I know there are donate buttons there. That's all you got to do. But we really encourage y'all to support this work. We are honored that our work helped lead to this work, and we will support it in whatever way we can, because this is our history, and it's so important for us to understand this hidden stuff. And there's just no reason to hide it. It is what it is. And two, I also want to say right here, I've heard from people who graduated from SEG academies since some of this work, even this Noxubee story, where they want to engage in conversations about how to teach the history in those schools. Wouldn't that be something? If we could really, if we can really, in whatever ways we all can, to help make that happen and to facilitate those conversations, if we can just get past the politics and all of that garbage and just focus on the truth. So Ellen Ann, thank you so much for being here. We're so happy that you were here.
This has been great. Okay, send your stories in. Yeah,
that's right. Send your stories to Ellen Ann. What else I need to tell y'all? Ray Mavis. Go ahead. Ray Mavis, former governor and Secretary of the Navy, is going to join us for a member conversation on Tuesday, August 2nd. As you can see the time there, we know this is going to be a far-reaching conversation Secretary Mavis is very outspoken on Twitter, as some of you may know, and in the columns that he's done in the Mississippi Free Press. This is a member-only event, but the good news is that you can become a member for as little as $10 a month and make Kimberly very, very happy while you're doing that. And when you do that, you get access to all of our conversations to date. And there's so many great ones that some of them we all just cried. Like Randall Pinkston and Rena Evers, we all cried, but they were really great conversations. So hope you guys can join us for Ray Mavis on Tuesday night. And as far as MFP Live, we're planning to go on hiatus for the month of August and then come back with our September season, our fall season, unless there's a special show that pops up. And if so, special interview, there might be one coming up, and we'll let you guys know about that on social media and on the MFP list. And then otherwise, if you just want to give a straight donation to Ellen Ann, you know how to do it, as well as to our nonprofit media outlet. Just go to mfp.ms/donate. There's some fantastic stories on the site this week. Grace Marion dropped one today about a race divide around a Batesville City Park that is just blowing it up over in social media, for instance. So please go read that story about the systemic racism that this story kind of unpacks, and the other work that we're doing. We really appreciate you guys. Please share these shows. A lot of our viewers see them afterward and watch for the podcast coming soon. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Ellen Ann. We'll see y'all soon.